Thank you so much for being here today.
Oh, well, thank you for making it happen. And I am told by Tim that I just have to answer questions, which is great.
All right, well, we are live. Welcome, everybody. We're going to get started here in just a minute. We've got a packed house today, and I want to make sure everybody gets in, and then we'll turn it over to Robin here in a second, and we're pleased to have Riane with us today. It's going to be a great conversation, so looking forward to jumping in, and what are we about a minute, 2 minutes past. Well, why don't we do this? Yeah, it looks like we've got a lot of folks in here. So real quick, everybody, thanks again for joining us for another session this Thursday. And as with all the sessions, you will get the recording typically a day following the session today. You can always go to the Montessori Foundation YouTube page to see any of the previous recordings. Um, this is gonna be a conversation today, so we would love for you to participate as best you can. I know it's webinar format, via chat, but use the Q&A feature, use the chat feature. Please feel free to ask questions throughout today's presentation, and we'll certainly make sure we try to get to everybody before the end of the hour. And with that being said, Robin, why don't I turn it over to you? I'll go kind of behind the scenes here and just monitor the chat, and Robin, I'll turn it over to you to do some intros.
Okay, well, thank you, Clint. Thanks for having me, Lindsay. Thanks for having me. I know both of you, but I've never participated on this particular webcast. So for those of you who I don't know, it's nice to see you. And so today I'm really delighted to participate with one of my friends and colleagues in education and just the world, Dr. Riane Eisler. And so, Rand, I'm going to let you. One of the questions I have is a little bit about your story, so I'm not going to get into it too much. But Dr. Eisler is a world-renowned author and uh, speaker throughout the world. One of the books that we're going to be focusing on today, as this is an education-based webcast, is her book Tomorrow's Children. And Rhiannon and I, over the last really 4 or 5 years, have done a lot of work together on this particular book, creating a course that's maybe it's geared towards Montessori, but it's really geared towards the concept of partnership systems, partnership education, and really how that impacts the work we're doing with children as we try to make a positive impact on the world. So, without me getting into that, I'm going to start with a series of questions just to get Rianne talking, because again, we have the expert here, and so I want to give you all the chance to hear from her. So, Rianne, thank you so much for joining us here today, and it's always a pleasure to be with you.
Well, it's a great pleasure for me to be here. I can't see our audience. Is that by design?
Yes, I think so. Clint's probably the expert, but the webinar format is us talking and people can write in with their questions and Clint's going to be monitoring the Q&A. And so I think actually it's a good way to sort of segue in. If you have questions throughout, please write them in the forum. We are going to try, time permitting, to have some time at the end for you all to ask specific questions that may come up as we go through this discussion today. But please feel free to participate. So,
Great.
Rianne, um, as some of these people that are participating may not be familiar with your work on partnership systems, partnership education, the difference between partnership systems and domination systems, before I figured we could get started with asking you that simple question. What are partnership systems? What is the work you're doing?
Well, the work I'm doing is whole systems analysis. And I arrived to that through a rather circuitous route. Um, my first job was with an offshoot of the Rand Corporation way back. Um, and it was I found out about systems analysis, but it wasn't really systems analysis because it didn't look at the whole of society. And so I'm saying this by introduction because my work really looks at all the core components. The methodology I introduced, which is the study of relational dynamics, looks at, first of all, what kinds of relations does a particular social system support or inhibit? And secondly, what is the relationship between the core components of a social system? And yes, I include family and children and gender, which are really marginalized, if you think about it, in conventional studies of society, in sociology, and also really marginalized. They're beginning to enter more into education, like gender, like family, but they're marginalized in our conventional categories: right, left, religious, secular, Eastern, Western, Northern, Southern. And so I came out, this was a long way of introducing things, with the configuration of a scale, the partnership domination scale. And on one side are top-down societies. It can be, well, contemporary societies. You look at the Taliban, for example, they pay a lot of attention to gender, don't they? And they pay a lot of attention to family. So does fundamentalist Iran. So these are Eastern religious societies. But if you look, for example, at Nazi Germany or the former USSR or Putin's Russia, or the regression that's happening right in our country today, you see that a lot of attention is being paid to gender. We may not be highlighting that, but it's there. I mean, rigid gender stereotypes, the ranking of one form of humanity, the male, over the female, and nothing in between, even though there has always been people in between. You move to the other side, you see, well, compared to this in-group versus out-group thinking, feeling, behaving, which is really inculcated into us. I mean, look at the caveman cartoons, for example. You know, with one hand, he's got a weapon, a club, for its fear of pain. And with the other, he's dragging a woman by the hair. And we're told this really before our brains are fully formed. So all of us have been exposed to it. But if you look at the partnership side, you see something very interesting. All the progressive social movements have challenged the same thing: domination. I mean, think of the Enlightenment in modern history, challenging the so-called divinely ordained right of kings to rule over their quote subjects. Think of the feminist movement, challenging again the so-called divinely ordained right of men to rule over the women and children, boys and girls, and everybody in between, in their castles, you know, military metaphor of their homes. You look at the so-called challenge, you know, first the abolitionist movement, then the civil rights movement, then the Black Lives Matter movement, challenging again the so-called divinely ordained right of a quote superior race to rule over inferior ones, all the way to the environmental movement, challenging again the so-called divinely ordained dominion, right? Dominance, domination. So the regression that we're going through right now is really in reaction to these movements. I mean, including the social and economic justice movement, the peace movement. You know, we had a forum, a virtual forum that I invite you all, and you have the link to it because people can still watch it. It's called Peace Begins at Home. And yeah, it does, because what happens if you have family violence, domestic so-called violence, which I'm trying to change to family violence because it resonates more. We're so used to dismissing, quote, domestic violence. Well, because it is associated with violence against women and children, also some violence against men, but the mass of it is to keep women and children in their place, right? It's about domination. So the partnership system is the system that we're trying to create, but we're trying to create it in bits and pieces rather than having this partnership frame that sees the relationship, and I'm going to stop in a minute, between what I call the four cornerstones, family and childhood, and they're the four cornerstones of either domination-oriented system or partnership-oriented system. And we have those, by the way. Not only we're discovering so many prehistoric societies that really oriented more for millennia to the partnership side. But the Nordic nations, Finland, which, by the way, is always ahead in education. I mean, I'm looking at somebody who just posted because that I can't see. Ireland quickly moved towards partnership, but also some, not all, indigenous societies, the Muso, in China, the Minangkabau in Asia. It's very interesting how we're discovering that, hey, contrary to what we're told, domination is not inevitable. But getting back to the four cornerstones, and then I'll stop. You've got family and childhood. Neuroscience shows the vital importance, and Maria Montessori really saw that. She was a pioneer. Gender, it's not just a women's issue. It's a primary family, social, and economic organizing principle. And yes, the third cornerstone is economics, and the fourth cornerstone is what tomorrow's children really focuses on, which is story and language. Because if you think of it, education has three components: process, structure, and content. What stories about, quote, reality are we told and internalized?
Well, and you don't ever have to feel like you stop in 2 minutes because I think everybody here would agree that we just listen to you talk for as long as you'd want to go. But yeah, that was a really great introduction to this whole concept of what are we even talking about with partnership systems, one of which you alluded to, the fourth corner, which really is about education. And so I do want to get to that towards the end, but I think that because many of the people attending may not be familiar with, may not be familiar with your work, and we just talked about what brought you to this place professionally. But I always find it fascinating. I love hearing the story of what caught your interest in this work early on, because I think that that's a really relevant term. And one of the questions I'm going to ask you later, which I'll just tell you about, is why is what we're talking about today as important as it is right now, possibly the most important in the history of human civilization. So, can you tell all of us here a little bit about like your background, and you know why, but it's so powerful adding context to everything you're talking about. So, where did you come from, Riane?
Where do I come from? Well, yes, I have a lot of passion for this work, and that passion is deeply rooted in my experiences and observations as a child. I was born in Vienna, And really, from one day to the next, after the Anschluss, after the union with Nazi Germany, uh, my parents and I in Austria became hunted with license to kill. And on Kristallnacht, a gang of Gestapo men, both Austrian and German, broke into our home, dragged my father off. And uh, I witnessed the trauma of witnessing violence, domination, really, fear. But I also witnessed something that I today call spiritual courage. And it's something that my mother displayed. And it's not courage as we're taught, the courage to slay the dragon or to kill the, quote, enemy. It's the courage to stand up against injustice out of love. And my mother recognized one of the Nazis as a young man who had been an errand boy for the family business. And she got furious. She said, "How dare you do this to this man who has been so good to you?" And to make a long story short, she didn't get killed. Many Jewish people were killed that night. And by another miracle, she got my father's release and even got a safe conduit so that we were able to escape at night. My native Vienna, eventually they were able to purchase, money did pass hands, a ticket, an entry permit to Havana, to Cuba, where I grew up. But all of these experiences really, I saw both, partnership behavior and dominator behavior. And it led me to question why, when we humans have such an enormous capacity for caring, for really sensitivity, for nonviolence, why has there been so much violence, so much insensitivity, so much fear? And eventually, after many, many, many experiences, including law school, which was, again, training in systems analysis, by the way, because people don't come to your office and say, apply section 1222 of the blah, blah code to my case. They come with a story. And it's up to the attorney to figure out what is the applicable law, right? But I started my multidisciplinary cross-cultural research, and I saw right away that I couldn't find answers to that question of whether domination is inevitable. Is that just human nature, as we're told? And I came up with a resounding no. It is not inevitable. There is an alternative, and it's actually deeply rooted in history and prehistory. And that was the basis for the first book, drawing from that research, the book that I'm best known for, The Chalice and the Blade. And many books followed, including Tomorrow's Children, because I saw how important, how vital education, yes, and starting very early on, is for our past, present, and our potential future.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. So obviously we can't see their faces, but I don't love hearing the stories. It doesn't give me great joy to hear that, but it's such a fascinating story. So Rand, thanks for sharing that. And it does add great context to, I think, what brought you to this idea of partnership systems, why you're doing the work, and you know, and again, when we come to it, talking about why now, why is it so important, adds relevance. But now I want to ask and sort of change it a little bit. We talked about partnership systems, but most of the people here are educators. So a part of partnership systems is partnership education. And so again, I'm going to sort of give you a vague question because I want you to have the opportunity to share it rather than me coming up with my own convoluted definition. But like, what is partnership education then?
Well, Einstein said, and I'm uh, quoting what he said, you cannot solve problems with the same thinking that created them. And that really is the motto, isn't it? Behind um, all of my books stemming from this multidisciplinary cross-cultural research. And it leads directly to the question, what is partnership education? And it's an attempt to help children see, first of all, because we're like fish in water, we've been so many of the stories, whether it's original sin or selfish genes, for example, we're told we're bad, and we are told even denial, whether it's climate change denial or denial of COVID-19 or denial of election results. The trauma, because domination systems are trauma factories. And we've been trying during this period of disequilibrium, because, as you know, my work draws heavily from some of the newer theories about how transformative change can happen in complex living systems. Chaos theory, nonlinear dynamics, system self-organizing theory. So all of this really leads to tomorrow's children, doesn't it? Because, yes, this book, and it is amazing to me how timely that book really is, because it is, in looking at it now, I am amazed sometimes. No, it doesn't deal enough with the neuroscience. My latest book, Nurturing Our Humanity, describes the neuroscientific findings in detail, and then some. But it is it's multicultural, it's gender balanced. It is really for partnership, living and loving.
Great, thanks. Yeah, one of the things that, I think I might have mentioned this at the beginning, but Riane and I spent the better part of a year going through this book together and talking about it. And we have hours of footage, and maybe at some point we have a course that's going to come out if those of you are interested. But one of the things that struck me and continues to strike me is this whole notion of partnership education is not just a curriculum, meaning there are certain lessons, but it's about redefining how we think about these, I'll call them subcultures, but these different groups, meaning, if even just the basic language we use with young children can have an impact on their developing these notions of domination. So it's A, being deliberate with what we speak or don't speak, um, and B, trying to be extra aware so we can try to actively change what currently exists. Does that make sense, Ryan?
Yes, it makes a lot of sense, because how can we really accept in bits and pieces? And that's happening, I mean, big time. There are NGOs all over the world. I see that in the chat, there's a posting from Soraya Rafat about Iran. And yes, gender is, look, there are only two halves of humanity. And we're told that ranking and rigid gender stereotypes are, that's just the way it is. And we see all around us that, hey, men are diapering babies, feeding babies, doing women's work, and women are leading, as best as we can. Um, these gender stereotypes, I mean, there's a difference between female and male, obviously, but we don't know what that difference really is because we have all been steeped and taught that these gender stereotypes are inevitable, contradicting what we see with our own eyes, right? What we experience. Um, you know, I think that tomorrow's children is so necessary today. And because, look, progressive education um, has focused, well, there are three elements of education as I start in tomorrow's children. Well, it starts really with early childhood education, with parenting, frankly, because we've got to change. And that was the subject of our virtual summit, Peace Begins at Home. Because what does violence at home do? Family violence normalizes violence. So there's a connection between family violence and war. This is about connecting the dots. And we can't connect the dots the way that history, for example, our past is taught to us. We just can't. There's so much, but anyway, education is composed of these three components: process, and there's been progressive education has paid a lot of attention to how we teach. And that's evolving quite nicely, actually, and has even reached, to some extent, people in public education. Structure, that's a tough one because I make the distinction between hierarchies of domination and hierarchies of actualization, because every society needs parents, needs teachers, and more complex societies need managers, leaders. Leaders are necessary. But the question is, how is power conceptualized and used?
Well, yeah.
Yeah,
Well, one thing again I talk about just thoughts I've had over the past years that you've talked about going back to this notion of starting with early childhood and the active versus the passive attempts to try to change the narrative. But one thing that you talk about somewhere in your book is just, with the young children, right? Rather than necessarily assuming that the man's going to be outside shoveling the snow and the woman's going to be in their kitchen, you don't have to verbalize it necessarily, but by being aware and just doing things differently as it comes naturally, that you are changing the way these young children start internalizing the partnership of a marriage, right? And so that was a really important thing for me to think about is again, as an educator, I can be aware and just do things differently that will change the impact they have on young children. And that's and
absolutely.
and and then as they get older, and this is why I want to bring it up with you is and ask you is, as they get older, and they're or again they have not been immune to seeing all the cartoons was as a caveman you say, so they have notions of what is masculine and feminine, right? Like it is masculine to be brave, for example, it is feminine to be sensitive. But as an educator and as a parent, I can, if I recognize that those are out there, I can actively try to um I'm gonna say like desexualize, but that
Degender.
degender some of these feelings. And that's an active thing I can do when I'm talking with children, when I'm talking with, well, even adults, right? It is not it does not have to be perceived weakness to be a man who is sensitive or a man who cries, right? So we can actively do that. So that's a second piece of like one of the things I hear you saying that is really important to change society. And then there's yet a third level, which is as an educator, actively teaching to try to change the narrative. And one example I think you write about in your book, or maybe I just internalized it from your book. And actually, this is a fun activity for everybody in the audience, maybe. You talk a lot about the work that your husband, your late husband, did with Charles Darwin, right? And I don't know if this is an exercise again in your book or just something I did later. Um, but everybody knows about the origin of species, of course. And the big message that we all learn about evolution, which is a series of successful mutations, is that the strongest and fittest, right, survive. And so we teach that. Most schools in the world at some point in geography, or not geography, I'm sorry, biology, they teach that notion. And it is true, right? To a certain degree. But then in his second book, which the first question is always, did anybody know that Charles Darwin had a second book? To which most people, crickets. And then if you ask what it's called, again, crickets. But then you talk about how in his second book, the one that nobody knows, he talks about how human beings actually, amongst other, you know, other living species, defy that notion. And that is a good example of something when you're working with students, teaching those lessons also changes the narrative. Do you want to talk a little bit more about that? Because I think it's just a great story, and I think it's something you're passionate about.
I'm very passionate about this, and I'm very passionate about story and language, content. We hear so much about it now. The time is now for tomorrow's children because it does give examples of how we can just tweak the story. But getting back to David, I learned in my 45 years with David, which I I I can't say that I have ever gotten over his death because I haven't. But I learned that partnership in personal relations is so much more pleasurable. Mutual support, it's what we need. And yet, so little of our education is about how to relate to ourselves, to others, and to our planet, to Mother Earth. And that's one thing that Tomorrow's Children proposes, that we have education on how to relate, for goodness sakes. We have choices, don't we? Domination or partnership. So, but getting back to Darwin, yes, David did a very interesting thing. He used a computer count of how often in his second book, The Descent of Man, and Darwin was a creature of his times. I mean, he talked about man, including woman, which is the way that we're still taught, consciously and unconsciously, by the way. As an attorney, I know that the British common law, for example, said that, the husband and wife are one, and the one is the husband. Finished, period. And the feminist movement, which has gotten because there are many feminist movements, and yes, some feminists have had terrible experiences with men, but again, I want to emphasize that partnership, look, the alternative to patriarchy is not matriarchy, it's partnership, okay? And there never was a matriarchy. And even societies that call themselves matriarchy give the impression that, well, if women, reverse the thing, even the film Barbie, was struggling with that. And I'm being nonlinear here because what really we know from linguistic psychology is that if we don't have the words, we are really stuck, And so the fourth cornerstone is language and story. And a lot of attention is being paid to story now. But David did a word count. First of all, the word count was on how often in his second book, which was Darwin said, it's now I'm going to talk about humans, and it's mostly cultural evolution. Okay. And in Descent of Man, he only mentions, I think, survival of the fittest 2 or 3 times, and one time to apologize for using that term. And he emphasizes in Descent of Man that for humans, cooperation, and he also emphasizes that, by the way, in Descent of Man, in his first book. I mean, he has a lot of examples of cooperation in nature. And of course, now scientists are finding more and more and more of this, like trees, caring for younger trees. Amazing. I mean, really. And Tomorrow's Children talks about some of the species like the bonobos, who are just as close in relationship to us as the common chimp, and who are much, much more cooperative. And yes, much, much more like us.
Well, and I think that that's why that's a good example of how powerful story can be, and how, I mean, imagine, and I've done this when you're talking to a group of adolescent students and trying to talk to them, it forces them to think about some of these things that are sort of counterintuitive to what they've been taught. And so I think that when we're talking about partnership education and that active piece of trying to do it, the very first thing is helping us, is all of us realizing, A, we can do that by simple things like introducing the second book. I mean, that's very tangible, or telling the other side of the story. And so I think one of the things that I would share for this group of educators is that is essentially the task that we're talking about here, is the passive thing of how we act and behave towards each other, but then a proactive approach of when we're teaching, including, things like that second story, or talking about the bonobo. Don't just talk about, wars and history, but include things that include components that include partnership, right?
Absolutely. And the difference between our cousins, because they're not directly in line with us, but they're very close. The DNA of both bonobos and chimps is the same, really, in terms of closeness with us. And one of the things that's happening now is research finding that bonobos are actually smarter, just more developed than common chimps in terms of their intelligence. But the thing is possibility. What is human nature is one of the central questions. And so much of what we're taught as history, for example, is about great men. And who are they? They're the conquerors, aren't they? And that's really crazy. And we live by stories. And the fact that there's so much talk about stories, and that when I wrote Tomorrow's Children, I emphasized that we live by stories. Humans live by stories, and stories that children internalize are so important. So we really have to show children that there is a partnership alternative and that we can build it. And frankly, we're at a place in our evolution where we are interconnected globally, not only by technologies of communication and transportation, but by technologies of destruction, like nuclear or biological weaponry, right? And more slowly by climate change. So I think that really the only conclusion is that domination is not capable of meeting our challenges. And if we don't switch to partnership, and it's difficult, because people who are really into the domination paradigm have a frame. We've all inherited that frame. The good news is how many of us are challenging it, right? In bits and pieces. The bad news is how many of us are really, well, in a domination trance.
Well, and I think that that brings up a really important piece, which, when I learned about partnership systems, it was when you and I started talking. It seems like a daunting task to essentially change one's frame of mind to, domination to partnership. But one thing I've heard over these years is you can start doing it slowly, you know, right now by just being aware, right? How you talk to children, what you say to children. And so I think that's a challenge I would say to anybody that's listening to this is don't think that, okay, it's basically, I'm going from being a carnivore to a vegan overnight. We're saying be aware and start doing these things and start doing them in your classroom and start interacting or being mindful when you're engaging with other people, partners, friends, strangers, etc. So you can start doing this. We can all start doing this right now in small bits, and the goal is ultimately to make a significant enough change that we essentially change the way children experience the world and then go on to lead the world. Is that a
Absolutely. And we have to change our economic system of rewards because both capitalism and socialism came out of the 1700s and 1800s, and we're now, of course, in the 21st century, post-industrial. And I use that old term advisedly because with AI, we really don't know how where we're going. Uh, I mean, we have to be ready in this time of regression with a better alternative. That's our job. And the better alternative has to be taught to children.
absolutely.
But look, uh, capitalism and socialism, Marx and Smith, both are creatures of their time. And while they challenged, traditions of domination, I mean, both capitalism and socialism challenged some traditions of domination, of top-down rule. Smith challenged mercantilism, right? The rule of kings and nobles, and it goes way back to Chinese domination economics. Uh, goes way back to Chinese emperors, to us, to the Assyrians, who ruled by force, really. I mean, um, the thing that we have to understand is that we are capable of something else and that we had something else. But how to build it, that is something that, well, this generation will have to do. This generation will have to do it quickly. uh, because both capitalism and socialism, look, there's always money, isn't there, for wars, for weaponry, but somehow there isn't enough money in public policy uh, for feeding children, for caring for children. I mean, you see it writ really large, don't you, right now, in this regression. It's very, very dangerous. But I also think that it can't last. But in its wake, there will be a lot of suffering. And it's our job to come up with a better alternative because caring for people, caring for our Mother Earth, caring for children, caring, it's coded feminine, isn't it?
Yeah, and
And that's why gender is so important to all of us, and why these gender stereotypes are so important in domination systems.
yeah,
Because if you can, and children see this in their homes, uh, if their homes are domination families, that caring is less than, right? Women are less than.
yeah,
That's got to change. That's why we have to pay attention to gender, and that's why we have to pay attention to family, but we have to change our economic reward system, because with women, I mean, the aim is not just to get a bigger piece of the existing economic pie for women, but to use a women's metaphor to bake a new pie, a better pie.
Love it. Yeah, I'm just taking a second here. Yeah, I mean, gosh, as you all can probably imagine, this is why there's many hours of discussion. A couple things I want to do because time is getting short, Rian. I wanted to say a couple things and then have you close and then open it up for anybody that had questions. One of the things that I think is, again, not trying to plug your book any more than anyways, but in Tomorrow's Children, the book, there are a lot of practical examples of how you can bring that into your classroom, which is, you know, an important piece. I know that there's a talks of a revision which would have more practical examples. Again, how to teach this in your classroom, give you the tools so that you can do it. Um, so I'm really excited for that, Rian. I wanted to ask you one final question, which you've sort of touched on, which is again, like, why is this more relevant now than at any other time in the history of humanity? Just a couple thoughts to close this out. Why is this work even more important? And it doesn't have to get into anything with politics, but just the state of the world, or just everything. Why is it so important right now? And then we'll open up to some questions.
Well, I think we all know the answer to that. We're going through a period of massive regression to domination globally. And that's suicidal because the domination system is simply not adaptive at this point in our technological evolution.
Okay. Wonderful. Well, Rand, thank you so much for all of that. It's always great to talk to you and see you. I'd like to, Clint, if you're there, or anybody who's watching, this is a unique opportunity to hear from Rand herself. And so I just want to open it up to if anybody wants to either share a comment or ask a question. Um, Now's a great time.
I see a couple questions that have come in, Robin. One here from Amy. What effective partnership do you suggest for all children transitioning to each level, from early childhood to primary to secondary? How systems such as education systems smoothen the process, ensuring future student readiness?
Wait, would you repeat that, please?
Sure. It is, what effective partnership do you suggest for all children transitioning to each level, such as from early childhood to primary or primary to secondary? How do systems such as the education system smoothen the process, ensuring future student readiness?
That's the question of the day, isn't it? Um, I think that there is what teachers need to know, which is a different story of human nature, of our past, of our present, and the possibilities of our future, for our future. And then there is what teachers can teach at various levels, depending on the age and the level of development of children. And Tomorrow's Children does focus a lot on story, on content. So I suggest that one thing that you can do is adapt some of the examples to your level of as an educator. The issue is to show that we have a better alternative, and let children who are very smart and very curious, let them figure things out. Give them some ideas of, for example, how we can change the humanities. I mean, the humanities are a joke. I mean, it's old white men talking about other white men in Western education. So it's talking about the domination system. That's not what children need to know. They need to know it exists, and that's a human possibility. Uh, you know, uh, there have been teachers in higher grades in high school that have actually assigned the chalice and the blade, for example, which is being borne out by, I mean, just if we don't know our past, we can't create our future, really. That's one of the lessons that we want to teach children. And I could go on, but I won't.
That's great. And we had another great question come in from Colleen here. Um, the goal is to change both form and content. In this cycle of dialectic moves to move us forward, I keep thinking of Horkheimer and Adorno saying that the wholly enlightened earth is radiant with triumphant calamity. And I'm struggling to keep thinking we will come out the other side with both a new form that allows new content to flourish. And thank you for open light for the future. A lot of great comments, by the way, but that's a great question.
Well, I think that we can come out the other side with both a new form, which is process and structure, and a new story, which is content, a new series of stories. And as I said, Tomorrow's Children is full of examples of both how we teach and what we teach, because we have really ignored what we teach to a very large extent, certainly in public education. And that has to change. And I know that most of the audience here are Montessori people, and you're way ahead of the curve. But Maria Montessori wrote at a time before the findings from neuroscience, before many of the findings about our past. So we need to update the story. And that, because education, and I really wonder what the effect will be of AI, because, for example, programming is beginning to be done by AI all over. I mean, it looks like AI will take over many jobs, but it can't take out the caring jobs, can it, completely? Care, we want face-to-face contact. This is one of the problems with social media. It has really eliminated the face-to-face contact so much. And we have to really talk about that, because for most of our history, there was face-to-face contact, at least. So I think that we as educators have a tremendous job, which is to wade through the domination inheritance that we have, including the heritage in our education, and help children to see that we have another alternative, and that alternative can only be understood through story, content.
Great. So Robin and Riane, I think those are the only questions I see right now in the chat and in the QA section, Q&A section.
Well, I see Lindsay is still on. Lindsay, do you have some thoughts, or are you about to board?
Riane, I have lots of thoughts, and I think we might have to have you come back again. This has been such a fabulous time together, and I so appreciate your insight. And I hope that we can make the world a better place.
Well, I think there is hope that we can, and education plays a huge, huge part in that. And the importance of story is being recognized all over, by the way.
Absolutely.
And so the time is now,
Now more than ever.
more than ever.
Thank you again, Riane, and thank you, Robin, for being here to facilitate this discussion today. Always good to see so many people here joining us and participating in this important conversation.
Thank you for having me, Lindsay and Clint and Riane. Always a pleasure.
Well, it's always a pleasure to be here, and I see what is one change I would make in an educator. I would encourage an educator to make in the 5 great lessons today. And I leave the answer to you because tomorrow's children is full of examples of really examples of how we can change what we teach at all levels.
Can I add to that one? And Adriana. So for those of you who aren't familiar, the great lessons that Adriana is referring to are the 5 great lessons of the elementary curriculum. And I've never thought about that, but I do. But Michael Dorr, one of my colleagues, was really, and so I'm really into the telling the story, great lessons. And I would say, Adriana, if you are an elementary teacher that regularly teaches those great lessons, I would task you, and I'd be very curious to know, ask your students what changes could they make to the great lessons? Because I think that's actually a really fascinating question, and I'm going to think about it. But I would love to hear what children, what the students think, if we know that the purpose of the great lessons is to frame the entire elementary curriculum and establish relevance for everything we're doing. I would love to hear from maybe some 6 years, what needs to be added.
And if you ask children what is your best relationship and what is your worst relationship, they invariably come up with a relationship where they're respected, where they're listened to, where they're heard, the partnership relationship. And their worst relationship is where they're dissed and where they're just treated as if they didn't know anything, like an empty vessel, right, that we have to fill. And that's not what children are. Children are curious and observant, and we we mistake fear for respect. We've all been taught that.
Clint, any
All right.
final words?
No, I think that's the perfect way to end it.
All right.
Well, thanks everyone. Next week we have Dr. William Summers presenting Joy and Keeping Hope Alive, which dovetails nicely with Riane's inspirational method. So we look forward to seeing everyone next week, and Riane, we'll hope to see you back again soon.
Well, I'm looking forward to our class.
Yes.
I really am. And I'm looking forward to seeing and talking with all of you and to seeing you really and talking with you in the class. And
Yes.
thank you so much for this opportunity. And somebody wants to know, are there more details about
We
the
will
upcoming class?
we'll make sure Clint and Lynn that everybody shares information. It's coming it's coming soon, but it's almost there. But yes, we will make sure that it's well publicized and that everybody has the opportunity to attend and participate.
Boy, you have so many questions here. Is there a mailing list for the class? Should we contact Robin? Uh, And thank you so much. All of you, I see that I see so many positive comments, and I look forward to seeing you all. Bye bye.
Riane.
Thank you,
Thank you, everybody.
Riane. See you all next week. Thank you.
Bye.
Bye bye.